Less than 2 hours. That is how close the United States and Canada came to a full-blown tariff collision at midnight on August 19th, 2026. In a Truth Social post published Tuesday night, President Donald Trump announced he was pausing a new round of 50% tariffs on Canadian goods, tariffs that were set to hit at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time. According to the Associated Press, the two countries had reached a last-minute agreement to delay the measure by 3 days while negotiations continued. Prime Minister Mark Carney's office confirmed it in a statement, saying substantial progress had been made, but that important work still remained. That is the real headline. Not a knockout, not a collapse. A pause, negotiated in the final hours, after 18 months of escalating economic pressure between two countries that share the longest undefended border on Earth. To understand how Ottawa and Washington ended up standing at that midnight cliff edge, you have to go back to the very start of this fight, because this was never a single dispute. It was a slow-building sequence of tariffs, counter-tariffs, court rulings, and last-minute reprieves, each one changing the leverage on both sides of the border. The story begins in early 2025. Donald Trump, newly returned to the White House, moved quickly to reshape trade relationships with America's closest neighbors. He first announced new tariffs on Canada on January 31st, 2025, framing them as a response to fentanyl trafficking across the northern border, and what his administration described as unfair trade practices. Within weeks, the United States had imposed a sweeping 25% tariff on a wide range of Canadian goods. Canada did not sit still. Ottawa responded with its own counter-tariffs on American products worth 30 billion Canadian dollars, according to reporting from Global News, with a further $125 billion worth of goods slated to follow within 3 weeks if no resolution was found. It was in the middle of this early storm that Canada changed leaders. Mark Carney, a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, was chosen to replace outgoing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as head of the Liberal Party in March 2025. In his first speech after that win, Carney did not mince words. He called the United States a country Canada could no longer trust, and delivered what would become one of the defining lines of his early premiership, that Americans should make no mistake, in trade as in hockey, Canada will win. It was a bold statement for a central banker turned politician to make about his country's largest trading partner. Whether it would hold up against the reality of cross-border economics was, at that point, still an open question. Through the spring of 2025, the tariff war widened. Trump's administration slapped a 25% tariff on imported automobiles and parts, a move Carney publicly called a direct attack on Canadian workers and industries. Speaking after convening Canada's Cabinet Committee on Canada-U.S. relations, Carney accused Washington of wanting to, in effect, own Canada, and vowed that would never happen. Around the same time, new tariffs hit steel and aluminum. Carney's incoming government responded by saying it would keep its own tariffs in place until the United States showed, in his words, respect, and made credible, reliable commitments to free and fair trade. This was the pattern that would define the next year and a half: an American tariff announcement, a Canadian public rebuke, a retaliatory measure from Ottawa, and then a fragile round of talks to try to walk the temperature back down. By the summer of 2025, Trump was threatening even broader measures, including a 35% across-the-board tariff on nearly all Canadian goods, with an August 1st deadline. That particular threat came with a doubling clause attached, meaning tariffs could climb to 50% if no deal was reached, though that escalation was paused when Trump extended the deadline. Carney, speaking to reporters in French at the time, described the negotiations as intense and delicate, language that would echo almost word for word more than a year later, in the closing days of August 2026. Here is where the story takes its most consequential turn, and it is the piece of this saga that gets the least attention in casual coverage, even though it may be the single biggest shift in negotiating leverage the entire conflict produced. On February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court issued its ruling in Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump, a case consolidated with Trump versus VOS Selections, Inc. The question before the court was simple to state, but enormous in consequence. Did the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known as IEEPA, give the president the authority to impose tariffs at all? In a 6-3 decision written by Chief Justice John Roberts, the court held that it did not. The justices found that IEEPA does not authorize the president to impose tariffs, and that the tariffs Trump had imposed under that law exceeded the scope of authority Congress had delegated to the executive branch. According to legal analysis published by the law firm WilmerHale, the ruling affirmed an earlier en banc decision from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which had already found the tariffs unlawful in August 2025. The scale of that ruling is difficult to overstate. Coverage from Norton Rose Fulbright noted that the decision effectively invalidated all tariffs imposed under IEEPA since their inception, including the so-called reciprocal tariffs that had been placed on imports from most countries around the world starting in April 2025, and the earlier fentanyl-related tariffs that had targeted Canada, Mexico, and China specifically. Analysis from Thomson Reuters estimated the ruling could unlock as much as $175 billion in potential tariff refunds for importers who had paid duties under the now invalidated authority. On the day the ruling came down, the president issued an executive order acknowledging that the IEEPA-based tariffs were no longer in effect and ending their collection, according to a subsequent events disclosure filed with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. This is the moment that comes closest to matching the kind of leverage shift a headline might call a knockout move, except it was not Carney's doing. It was the American judicial system checking the American executive branch. The ruling stripped away one of the legal foundations the Trump administration had been using to justify sweeping tariffs, and it forced a strategic pivot in Washington. According to the law firm A&O Shearman, the decision left the mechanics of implementation unresolved and introduced significant legal and commercial uncertainty, while signaling that the administration intended to pivot to alternative statutory authority to keep tariffs in place. In plain terms, the Supreme Court told the president he could not use IEPA as a blank check for tariffs. It did not tell him he could not use tariffs at all. It just meant he had to find a different legal doorway to walk through, and Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, along with Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 and Section 232 National Security Authority, became those doorways. That pivot happened fast. On July 20th, 2026, President Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a statute that allows the president to impose tariffs when a foreign country is deemed to have discriminated against American commerce. According to legal analysis from the firm Blake's, the 3 proclamations targeted motor vehicles, dairy, and alcoholic beverages from Canada, each one framed as an offset against what the administration characterized as discriminatory Canadian trade practices. The Motor Vehicles Proclamation pointed specifically to Canada's 25% retaliatory surtax on American vehicles, a countermeasure Ottawa had introduced back in April 2025 in response to earlier U.S. auto tariffs. The Dairy and Alcohol Proclamations pointed to Canada's near-total restriction on American alcohol sales through provincial liquor boards, and to preferential dairy market access that Canada had extended to the European Union but not to the United States. Despite the name, the motor vehicles list did not actually contain many cars. According to trade data compiled by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, that particular list covered electronics and telecom equipment, furniture and home goods, building materials including lumber, plywood, doors and cement, plastics and packaging, clothing, footwear and luggage, toys and sporting goods, machinery and manufacturing inputs, cosmetics and fragrances, and agricultural products like flowers, plants, and seeds. In total, the 3 lists touched well over a dozen distinct Canadian industries. Reporting from public radio station WAMC noted the tariffs also covered kitchen cabinets among the building materials category, illustrating just how far the measure reached beyond its headline categories. The White House said the measures would apply to roughly $20 billion worth of goods imported from Canada, according to reporting compiled by the outlet Quartz, with no exemption carved out even for products that would otherwise qualify for duty-free treatment under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, commonly known as USMCA, or, on the Canadian side, CUSMA. Energy, potash, fish, and critical minerals were excluded from the new 50% duty, as were goods already subject to separate tariff regimes. Trade compliance specialists at GHY International flagged a detail that caught many Canadian exporters off guard. The tariff applied based on the date goods entered the United States and cleared customs, not the date they shipped from Canada. That meant a shipment leaving a Canadian warehouse on August 18th could still be hit with the full 50% duty if it did not clear the American border before 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on August 19th. It was a logistical trap layered on top of a political one, and it forced companies on both sides of the border to plan for the tariffs as though they were certain to take effect, even while negotiators worked toward a different outcome. And Section 338 was not the only new pressure applied that summer. On July the 23rd, 2026, the Office of the United States Trade Representative announced an additional 10% tariff on Canada under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which took effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time the following day. According to the timeline compiled by Blake's, this new duty applied to imports from countries that had not committed to adopting forced labor import prohibitions, with CUSMA-compliant Canadian products exempted from that particular measure. Layered on top of that came adjustments to the separate Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper, which took effect on June 8th, 2026, restructuring how derivative metal products were taxed while keeping the headline 50% rate on core metal imports. By the end of July, then, Canada was facing a genuinely layered tariff structure. Section 232 duties on steel, aluminum, and copper, a new Section 301 duty tied to labor standards, and the looming Section 338 50% duty on dairy, alcohol, and the broad goods category still labeled motor vehicles. Each authority rested on a different legal foundation, a direct consequence of the Supreme Court closing off the IEPA route back in February. It is worth pausing on that point because it is central to understanding what actually happened to Trump's leverage. The ruling did not eliminate his ability to use tariffs as a negotiating tool. It fragmented that ability across multiple statutes, each with its own legal tests, its own procedural requirements, and its own vulnerabilities to future court challenges. That is a meaningfully different kind of leverage than a single sweeping emergency authority, but it is still leverage, and the events of mid-August 2026 show it was still powerful enough to bring Ottawa back to the negotiating table under real pressure. There was also a structural deadline sitting underneath all of this that gets far less attention than the tariff proclamations themselves. The Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement includes a built-in 6-year joint review requirement. According to the Blake's timeline, that joint review was conducted pursuant to Article 34. 7 of the agreement, and the United States did not agree to extend the pact for another 16-year term when the July 1st, 2026 deadline passed. Analysis from the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Agreement Tracker, maintained by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, noted that with the extension deadline passed without American agreement, the broader trade relationship shifted into a cycle of annual reviews instead, a change that is likely to keep pressure on both governments for years, rather than resolving the underlying uncertainty in one clean negotiation. Against that backdrop, the countdown to August 19th became one of the most closely watched trade deadlines of Carney's time in office. Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc met with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer in Washington on August 11th, in what Reuters described, according to reporting picked up by Quartz, as the third meeting between the two sides in as many weeks. LeBlanc, joined by Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette, wrote afterward that Canada remained committed at the negotiating table and continued to work diligently to advance and defend Canadian interests. According to BNN Bloomberg's reporting, negotiators from both countries were aiming to present a completed framework for a deal to President Trump before the deadline arrived. Items reportedly on the table included eliminating Canada's retaliatory auto tariffs, lifting provincial restrictions on American alcohol sales, and reworking the structure of Canada's dairy quota system, the very issues the July 20th proclamations had cited as justification for the 50% duty in the first place. Coverage from Fortune around the same period captured the texture of just how specific and, at times, oddly granular this fight had become. If no deal was reached by the deadline, Trump had threatened 50% tariffs on $20 billion worth of Canadian products, ranging, as Fortune put it, from hockey sticks to tongue depressors, a detail that underlines just how deep into everyday manufacturing and healthcare supply chains this dispute reached. Christopher Gunderman, a fellow in the economics program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, told Fortune that, from Carney's perspective, USMCA needed to be renegotiated, but that you cannot renegotiate a trade pact in the middle of a full-blown trade war. Daniel Bayland, a political science professor at McGill University in Montreal, offered a similarly pointed read on Carney's domestic political constraints, telling Fortune that Canada's government could not afford to look like it was simply caving to the Trump administration's demands, given how much public anger in Canada had built up over the preceding 18 months. That domestic pressure is a real and verifiable factor in why Carney's negotiators held out as long as they did rather than accepting an early settlement. By August 13th, CBC News reported that Greer said both Trump and Carney would soon be presented with options following the latest round of trade talks in Washington. That framing, options rather than a finished agreement, signaled the negotiations were serious but still unresolved with less than a week to go. Global News reported on August 17th that Canadian negotiators remained in Washington through the weekend in what had turned into a last-second bid to secure a deal, with Conservative opposition leader Pierre Poilievre publicly stating that any new agreement had to remove softwood lumber tariffs as well, adding a domestic political dimension to the pressure Carney was under, not just from Washington, but from his own parliament in Ottawa. A managing principal at the trade law firm Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg, J. Nicole Bivens Collinson, told listeners of the STNR 2 Minutes in Trade podcast on August 12th that there was, in her words, a credible chance. Implementation would be delayed while an interim agreement was finalized, but that for now, companies should plan as if the tariffs would apply. That assessment turned out to be almost exactly right. On the evening of August 17th, LeBlanc and Greer wrapped up meetings in Washington. Reporters shouted questions at Greer as he left. His only response was no comment. LeBlanc told reporters the two sides would continue working, adding that their job was not yet done. A short statement from a LeBlanc spokesperson on Sunday, August 16th, described a 1-hour virtual meeting between LeBlanc, Greer, and Charette as constructive, noting that both negotiating teams had taken stock of the work completed so far, and that discussions were continuing. Then came the moment the headline promises. The twist at the very edge of the deadline. According to reporting from NPR, President Trump posted on Truth Social on the night of August 18th, less than 2 hours before the 50% tariffs were set to take effect, announcing he was suspending the new duties for 3 days based on a pending trade deal between the two countries. Carney's office, in its own statement, confirmed that Canada had agreed to the 3-day delay while negotiations continued, describing substantial progress, but stressing that important work remained. Candice Lang, president and chief executive of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, told reporters the delay provided relief for both countries, a sentiment echoed across Canadian business circles that had spent weeks bracing for the duty to hit. It is worth being precise here about what did and did not happen, because this is exactly the kind of moment that gets flattened into oversimplified headlines. Canada did not destroy Trump's leverage. The 50% tariffs were not canceled. They were delayed by 3 days, explicitly tied to continued negotiations rather than a finished agreement. Carney's own language, substantial progress, but important work remaining, is the language of a negotiator buying time, not declaring victory. At the same time, it would be equally inaccurate to say Canada simply caved. Ottawa held firm through 18 months of escalating tariffs, kept its own retaliatory measures in place for extended periods, and arrived at the final week of talks with specific asks still on the table, including relief on softwood lumber and changes to the broader tariff structure. The honest picture is a negotiation still in motion, not a finished fight with a clear winner. The Canadian side of this conflict was never limited to federal tariffs and trade minister statements. Provinces took their own retaliatory steps throughout 2025 and into 2026. According to trade tracking, published by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Nova Scotia doubled tolls on the Cobequid Pass for commercial vehicles arriving from the United States, removed all American alcohol from Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation shelves, and set aside $200 million in its 2025-2026 budget as a contingency fund to help the province manage the economic fallout from the tariff war. The Northwest Territories halted its liquor and cannabis commission's purchases of American goods entirely. Provincial governments across the country reviewed procurement policies with an eye toward eliminating purchases from U.S. companies wherever alternatives existed, and some jurisdictions began looking for opportunities to cancel existing contracts tied to American suppliers, or to reject future bids outright specifically because of the tariffs. It is worth stepping back briefly to explain why USMCA sits at the center of so much of this fight in the first place, because a lot of viewers hear the acronym without knowing what it actually governs. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which Canadians typically call CUSMA, replaced the older North American Free Trade Agreement during Trump's first term in office, and it was designed to give Canadian, American, and Mexican goods largely duty-free access across all 3 borders, provided they met specific rules of origin. That is precisely why the Section 338 tariffs announced in July 2026 were so significant. They applied even to goods that would otherwise have qualified for that duty-free treatment under CUSMA, effectively overriding the core protection the agreement was supposed to guarantee. According to the Blake's timeline of key tariff dates, this was a deliberate design choice by the administration, not an oversight. And it is part of why Canadian negotiators treated the July 20th proclamations as such a serious escalation rather than a routine trade dispute. The economic stakes behind all of this are not abstract. A report prepared for the Canadian-American Business Council by Oxford Economics, published in August 2026, described the current period bluntly as one of turbulence, noting that tariffs and counter-tariffs had disrupted long-standing commercial ties between the two countries, and that uncertainty around the future of USMCA had added complexity to long-term investment decisions on both sides of the border. The report framed the U.S.-Canada relationship as more than a trading partnership, calling it a strategic economic alliance that supports millions of jobs and underpins the security of both nations, while warning that continued tariff escalation and a potential USMCA breakdown would carry real costs for both economies, not just Canada's. On the business side, surveys conducted by Statistics Canada through its Canadian Survey on Business Conditions tracked how Canadian companies were adjusting in real time. The most recent published wave, covering responses gathered between July 2nd and August 6, 2025, examined anticipated impacts on sales, business uncertainty, and pricing over the following 12 months. Alongside the strategic adjustments, businesses said they were planning to navigate the environment. That kind of granular government-collected data is a useful corrective to sweeping claims about panic or collapse on either side of the border. The reality documented in these surveys was one of adaptation under sustained pressure, businesses adjusting supply chains, pricing and sourcing strategies rather than simply absorbing the shock or shutting down. It is also worth noting who actually bears the cost of a 50% tariff in practical terms, because this detail often gets lost in the political framing on both sides. Tariffs are paid by the importer at the border, meaning American companies bringing Canadian dairy, alcohol, lumber, or manufactured goods into the United States are the ones who write the check to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, not the Canadian exporter directly. Those costs then typically flow through to American businesses and consumers in the form of higher prices, unless companies absorb the margin, hit themselves, or find alternative suppliers outside Canada. That is one reason groups like the Canadian Chamber of Commerce frame the delay as relief for both countries, rather than a win for one side only. American importers, reliant on Canadian building materials, dairy inputs, or auto parts were facing the same deadline-driven cost spike as Canadian exporters, just from the opposite side of the transaction. On the American side, the picture is more mixed and, frankly, less dramatic than a word like panic would suggest. During an earlier escalation in March 2025, when Canada confirmed its retaliatory 25% tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars of American goods, U.S. household markets did see a rough trading session. According to reporting from TipRanks, Technology, Energy, and Materials, stocks led declines that Monday, with Nvidia falling more than 8% amid fears of stricter chip regulations, Amazon dropping over 3%, and Microsoft sliding just over 2%, all attributed in part to broader tariff anxiety rather than the Canada measures alone. That was more than a year before the August 2026 deadline, and it reflected a specific moment of market jitters tied to a cluster of overlapping trade tensions, not an ongoing state of panic sustained through to the present. Analysis published through the Globe and Mail in mid-2026, examining the potential market impact of the 50% duties before the delay was announced, described the likely initial reaction in conditional terms: increased volatility, downward pressure on Canadian sectors most exposed to trade disruption, with Toronto's stock exchange potentially underperforming global peers, given its concentration in resources, financials, and industrial companies. The analysis suggested investors would likely rotate toward defensive sectors such as utilities, telecommunications, and consumer staples, while companies with strong balance sheets and diversified revenue streams would be better positioned to weather the disruption. Notably, that analysis was framed entirely in likely and would terms, forecasting a possible reaction to tariffs that had not yet taken effect, rather than reporting a market panic that had already occurred. That distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to separate verified fact from dramatic framing. So where does that leave the actual balance of leverage between Ottawa and Washington as of this week? The most defensible reading of the verified record is this: the Supreme Court's February ruling was the single largest blow to the president's tariff authority in this entire conflict, and it happened independent of anything Carney's government did. It forced the administration to rebuild its tariff strategy on narrower, more legally contestable ground, spread across Section 301, Section 338, and Section 232 authorities instead of one sweeping emergency power. That is a real structural weakening of executive flexibility, even if it did not stop new tariffs from being imposed. Canada, for its part, did not fold. Carney's government kept retaliatory tariffs in place for well over a year, coordinated with provinces on additional countermeasures, and walked into the final week of talks before the August 19th deadline with specific demands still unresolved, forcing Washington to negotiate rather than simply impose. The 3-day delay secured on August 18th was a genuine, if narrow, negotiating win for Ottawa, buying time without abandoning Canada's core positions on autos, alcohol, and dairy access. Whether that becomes a lasting agreement or simply another temporary reprieve before the next deadline is, as of this recording, still an open question. There's also a broader historical thread worth naming here, because this is not the first time steel, aluminum, and automobiles have been the flashpoint between these two countries. Trump's first term saw similar disputes over steel and aluminum tariffs under Section 232 National Security Authority, disputes that were eventually resolved through negotiated exemptions rather than sustained duties. What makes the 2025 and 2026 period different based on the verified timeline is the sheer number of overlapping legal authorities now in play at once, and the speed at which the administration pivoted from one to another after the Supreme Court closed off IEPA in February. Trade lawyers at WilmerHale noted in their analysis of the ruling that Congress could still, in theory, provide new statutory authority for tariffs on firmer legal footing than IEPA offered, which means this fight is not simply between Ottawa and the White House. It also runs through the USC, Congress, and potentially through further litigation over whether Section 338, a statute that had gone essentially unused for nearly a century before 2026, can legally support tariffs of this scale and breadth. That obscurity is itself notable. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 had rarely, if ever, been invoked by a modern president before this administration turned to it as a workaround following the IAPA ruling. Its resurrection as a primary tool of trade policy is precisely the kind of development that could face its own legal challenges down the road, adding yet another layer of uncertainty to an already unsettled trade relationship. For now, though, it remains in effect, and it is the specific legal basis behind the 50% duties that were paused, not canceled, on the night of August 18th. What happens next depends on what Canadian and American negotiators can actually finalize within that extended window. The specific terms of any interim framework, whether it addresses softwood lumber the way Poilievre and industry groups have demanded, whether it resolves the broader question of CUSMA's now annual review cycle, and whether the Trump administration seeks yet another statutory pathway, if courts continue to narrow its options. All of that remains unresolved and should be treated as such rather than assumed. Now, in the interest of full transparency about where this information comes from. The verified facts in this script are drawn from named checkable sources, the Associated Press and NPR's reporting on the August 18th deadline extension, Reuters and Fortune's coverage of the negotiations leading up to it, CBC News reporting on trade talks involving USTR Jameson Greer and Canadian officials, Al Jazeera's coverage of the Trump-Carney phone calls, Global News reporting on Poilievre's position and the Washington negotiations, the official Supreme Court opinion and learning resources versus Trump alongside legal analysis from WilmerHale, Norton Rose Fulbright, A&O Shearman, and Thomson Reuters, trade compliance analysis from Blake's and GHY International, business impact tracking, from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business and Doane Grant Thornton, Statistics Canada's Canadian Survey on Business Conditions, the Oxford Economics Report prepared for the Canadian American Business Council, and market analysis published through the Globe and Mail and TipRanks, where sources offered forward-looking or conditional analysis, such as predicted market reactions to tariffs that had not yet taken effect, that has been presented here as analysis and forecasting, not as confirmed outcome. The characterization of America as being in a state of panic is not supported by the verified record as of this recording. What is supported is documented market volatility during specific earlier escalations, sustained business uncertainty on both sides of the border, and a real structural shift in the legal basis of presidential tariff authority following the Supreme Court's ruling. Anything beyond that, including any claim that Trump's leverage has been completely destroyed, should be treated as an open and contested question rather than settled fact, because, as of this week, negotiators from both countries were still at the table, and the 3-day extension had not yet produced a final agreement. One more piece of context deserves a place in this record before we close, because it speaks directly to why Ottawa has approached this entire standoff so cautiously rather than escalating harder and faster. Canada sends a significantly larger share of its total exports to the United States than the reverse is true for American exports to Canada, which means an extended trade war structurally hurts the Canadian economy more on a proportional basis, even though American consumers and importers absorb real costs too. That asymmetry is precisely why analysts like those at Oxford Economics framed continued escalation as carrying serious downside risk for Canada specifically, even while acknowledging the relationship remains genuinely two-directional, supporting jobs and supply chains on both sides of the border. It is also why Carney's rhetorical toughness in early 2025, the promise that Canada would win this fight the way it wins at hockey, always had to be balanced in practice against the reality that Canada's economy simply cannot walk away from its largest trading partner, the way it can trade tough talk in a press conference. Understanding that asymmetry is essential to understanding why a 3-day delay, rather than a dramatic breakthrough or a dramatic collapse, is exactly the kind of outcome this negotiation was always most likely to produce. If you have made it this far, do one simple thing that actually helps this channel keep doing deep, sourced research like this instead of recycled headlines. Hit subscribe right now, because the next few days around this deadline extension are going to move fast, and you will want to be here when the actual outcome lands. Second, drop a comment below with your honest read on this. Do you think Ottawa walks away from this with a real, durable agreement? Or is this simply the latest in a long line of temporary delays that gets renegotiated again in a few months? Scroll down and tell me exactly where you think this goes, because the comment section on stories like this consistently shapes what gets covered next. And third, if this breakdown actually helped you understand what is really happening between Washington and Ottawa, past the noise and the headlines, share it with one person in your life who keeps asking you what these tariffs actually mean. Because clear, Sourced information is the only real defense against getting swept up in exaggerated claims from either direction. This is a story that is not finished. Both governments have given themselves 3 more days as of this recording, and whatever comes out of those talks will shape trade between these two countries for years, not weeks. What do you think Carney's government should prioritize in these final negotiations? Protecting the auto sector, defending dairy supply management, or finally resolving the softwood lumber dispute that has outlasted multiple governments on both sides of the border? Leave your answer below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.